back in the 1950s, but this was before DNA, and back then it was known as forensic serology. And scientists would examine physical evidence to try to detect the presence of blood and other body fluids.
More than 320,000 Americans handed over their DNA to prove where their families came from. When scientists compared those samples against every country in Europe, one result kept appearing that nobody could explain. The ancestry Americans claimed the most barely showed up, and the one nobody claims dominated everything. Here's the deal. What you're about to hear comes from one of the largest genetic ancestry studies ever conducted. Researchers compared hundreds of thousands of American DNA samples against reference populations from more than 30 European nations. They weren't relying on family stories. They weren't trusting census records. They were reading the raw biological code. The one thing that can't be edited, rewritten, or passed down wrong at a dinner table. And what they found was a version of America that doesn't match a single history textbook. Entire ancestries inflated beyond recognition, others erased completely, and one country, the biggest genetic contributor of them all, written out of the national memory for over 200 years. The nation that forgot where it came from. Every American family has an origin story. Irish on dad's side, German on mom's, maybe a little Italian thrown in for flavor. These stories get passed down at Thanksgiving tables and family reunions like sacred texts, rehearsed, polished, and never questioned. But in 2023, a team of geneticists did something nobody had attempted at this scale before. They took DNA samples from more than 320,000 Americans and compared each one, marker by marker, against reference populations from every country in Europe. The results didn't just surprise them. The results dismantled everything Americans believed about where they actually came from. The study was led by researchers at multiple universities, working with one of the largest commercial DNA databases on the planet. They weren't testing a theory. They were running a comparison, raw genetic code against the documented populations of more than 30 European nations. No family stories, no census data, no old letters in a drawer, just biology. And biology doesn't care what your grandmother told you. What came back was a portrait of America that looked nothing like the one hanging in the national imagination. Entire ancestries had been inflated, others had been erased, and the country most Americans claimed as their deepest root wasn't even close to the top of the list. The test. Nobody expected to fail. The researchers started with a simple assumption. If millions of Americans say they're German, the DNA should show overwhelming German ancestry across the data. If Irish American is one of the most commonly claimed identities in the country, the genetic signal should light up Ireland like a beacon. It didn't. When the team mapped self-reported ancestry against actual genetic markers, the mismatch was staggering. Entire regions of the country were claiming origins that their DNA flatly contradicted, and the gaps weren't small, they were enormous, spanning centuries and thousands of miles. Take German ancestry. More than 40 million Americans identify as German American. It's the single most claimed European heritage in the United States. But the DNA told a different story. In state after state, the genetic markers associated with modern Germany were present, but nowhere near the levels those self-reports would suggest. Meanwhile, markers from countries most of those Americans had never mentioned were showing up in enormous concentrations. The same pattern repeated with Irish ancestry. Millions claim it. The genetics confirmed it, but often at far lower percentages than families believed. And sometimes the DNA pointed not to Ireland at all, but to regions of Britain that share deep genetic overlap with the Irish population. The identities were real, the proportions were wrong, and some of the origins were completely fabricated. The map that made no sense. When the geneticists plotted their results onto a map of the United States, something bizarre emerged. The South, a region where nearly every white family claims English or Scots-Irish roots, was swimming in DNA that pointed somewhere else entirely. The Midwest, long considered the heartland of German America, showed genetic signatures that didn't match modern Germany at all. Entire clusters of ancestry were pointing to countries that most Americans never mention at family gatherings, countries they had no memory of, countries that had been quietly written out of the story. In Appalachia, where Scots-Irish identity runs deep as gospel, the DNA showed heavy genetic overlap with populations from northern England and the Scottish lowlands, not the highlands most families romanticize. In Louisiana, French markers appeared exactly as expected, but next to them sat genetic signatures from Spain and West Africa in combinations no parish record had ever acknowledged. The Pacific Northwest, a region most people associate with Scandinavian settlers, carried unexpected Eastern European markers buried beneath the expected Nordic signal. Every region had its own secret, and the deeper the team looked, the more the official story of American immigration fell apart. The map wasn't wrong. The stories were. The Great Forgetting. There's a reason Americans don't know the truth, and it has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with survival. Between 1800 and 1924, more than 25 million Europeans poured through American ports. They arrived speaking languages their neighbors didn't understand, carrying customs their new country didn't want, and within a single generation, many of them made a choice, sometimes willingly, sometimes under enormous social pressure, to stop being who they were. Names were changed, languages were abandoned, children were told a simpler story, a safer story, one that would help them disappear into the American mainstream without attracting the wrong kind of attention. A Polish family might become simply European. A Hungarian household might claim Austrian roots. A family from the Balkans might say they were Greek because Greece sounded respectable and the Balkans sounded like trouble. It wasn't shame, it was strategy. Anti-immigrant sentiment in the late 1800s was vicious. Newspapers ran cartoons mocking Eastern Europeans as subhuman. Congress debated literacy tests designed to keep entire nationalities out. The message was unmistakable. Some origins were welcome, others were not. So people adapted. They picked the safest label available and never looked back. Within 2 generations, the real story was gone, replaced by something cleaner, something American. The records that lied. If DNA tells one story and family records tell another, you'd expect the paper trail to settle the question. It doesn't. Immigration records from the 19th century are a mess of misspellings, mistranslations, and outright fabrications. Ship manifests listed passengers by port of departure, not by nationality. A man born in a Polish village under Austrian rule might be recorded as Austrian. A Jewish family fleeing the Russian Empire might be listed simply as Russian. And those who arrived during waves of anti-immigrant hostility had every reason to lie on purpose. Ellis Island, the place Americans treat as sacred ground, made the problem worse. Inspectors processed thousands of arrivals a day. They didn't speak the languages. They couldn't spell the names. They wrote down what they heard, or what they guessed, or what was easiest. A name like Szczepanski became Stevens. Wojciechowski became Wilson. And once a name changed on paper, the ancestry changed with it. Census records compounded the errors. Enumerators walking door to door often recorded whatever the household told them. No verification, no cross-referencing, just a pencil and a ledger, and whatever story the family decided to give that day. The paper trail didn't preserve the truth. It buried it, one misspelled name at a time. The genetic geography. What the DNA revealed was a hidden map of America, one that had never been drawn before. The researchers could now trace specific European genetic signatures to specific American regions with startling precision. Scandinavian markers clustered exactly where you'd expect, across Minnesota and the Dakotas. But they also appeared in places nobody predicted. British Isles DNA dominated the eastern seaboard, but fragments of French, Finnish, and Eastern European ancestry showed up in counties where no immigration record had ever placed those populations. The patterns told stories that no history book had captured. Pockets of Iberian DNA, Spanish and Portuguese markers, scattered across the Gulf Coast and into the southwest, far beyond the regions traditionally associated with Hispanic settlement. Italian genetic signatures concentrated in the northeast, matching the known immigration waves. But quieter Italian markers also appeared across the mountain west, in mining towns and railroad camps, where official records listed workers only as foreign. And then there were the ghost populations, genetic clusters with no matching immigration narrative at all. Communities carrying markers from places like Finland, Lithuania, or the Basque Country. Populations too small to make the history books, but large enough to leave a permanent imprint in the American genome. The DNA remembered what the records forgot. The country America forgot. One finding stood out above all others. Across nearly every region of the United States, one European country was dramatically underrepresented in what Americans claimed, and dramatically overrepresented in what their DNA actually showed. The genetic signal was massive and unmistakable, threaded through millions of samples from coast to coast, and it pointed to an origin that most of those Americans had never once mentioned. A country whose emigrants had arrived in such enormous numbers that they reshaped the genetic landscape of an entire continent, and then, within 2 generations, vanished from the national memory entirely. The country was England, not Ireland, not Germany, not Italy, England, the single largest genetic contributor to the American population, and one of the least claimed ancestries in modern surveys. Fewer than 8% of Americans identify as English American today. But the DNA showed English markers dominating state after state, region after region, in concentrations that dwarfed every other European signal. How does an entire country disappear from a nation's memory? The answer is simpler than you'd think. English ancestry became invisible because it became the default. There was no ethnic neighborhood, no annual festival, no hyphenated identity to protect. Being English in America just meant being American. And over time, the origin itself stopped being mentioned at all. The biggest ancestry in the country, hidden in plain sight. The DNA doesn't lie, but families do, not out of malice, out of necessity. For more than 2 centuries, Americans have been telling themselves a story about where they came from. That story was shaped by survival, by prejudice, by paperwork errors, and by the simple human desire to belong. And generation after generation, the real origins faded, replaced by something simpler, something safer, something that fit the narrative of the moment. Now science has pulled back the curtain. 320,000 samples, 30-plus European nations, and a genetic map of America that looks nothing like the one we were taught. The English ancestry hiding in plain sight, the Eastern European roots buried under anglicized names, the communities that vanished from the record but never left the bloodline. America didn't forget where it came from by accident. It forgot on purpose. And if the country's own DNA can be rewritten in just 2 generations, what else has been quietly erased from the story we tell ourselves? If you want to uncover the histories that powerful institutions tried to bury, subscribe now, because the stories they never wanted you to hear are always the ones most worth telling.